In this video, we're going to talk about some of the characteristics of animals. All animals are heterotrophs, and if we look at this word, hetero means other, and troph means to eat or eater or feeder. So what this means is that animals have to eat other organisms in order to survive. So they cannot do photosynthesis like plants can, so they're not photoautotrophs. They rely on other organisms to get their energy and nutrients. Now, heterotrophs can come in different varieties. So herbivores are just heterotrophs or animals that eat plants. So this would be something like a cow. So a cow eats grass and hay and grains, and it's an herbivore. Now a carnivore is an animal that eats meat or eats other animals. So one example of a carnivore would be a cat. So think about even domestic cats, but also wild cats like tigers. They are obligate carnivores, meaning that they have to eat meat or else they'll die. They cannot survive on a vegetarian diet. Now, an omnivore is an animal that can eat both plants and animals. So humans, for example, we can eat other animals, we can eat meat, or we can eat vegetables and fruits and things that are plants. Some animals are parasitic, meaning that they rely on a host for survival. And they ultimately cause harm to the host in the process. Another characteristic of animals is that most of them are motile, meaning that they are able to move around. Now, some animals are sessile or stuck in place for part of their life cycle, but at least part of their life cycle, they will be modal or able to move around. And this is important because animals have to go find food. They can't photosynthesize, so they have to be able to either move around or move the environment around them in order to get food to them. Another characteristic of animals is that most of them have complex tissues. And a tissue is just a group of cells working together to perform a function. Now, we didn't really talk about tissues a lot when we talked about plants, but plants also had tissues. So with plants, we talked a little bit about the tissues that make up, like the leaves, for example. In animals, these tissues might be differentiated or specialized based on their structure and then their function. And so we're going to talk more about these specific types of tissues in a different lesson. But some examples of tissues are muscle tissue, nervous tissue, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. Some animals also have organs, and organs are just kind of another layer of organization. So an organ is just multiple tissues working together to perform a function. So for example, the digestive tract of a human has a layer of epithelial tissue, a layer of connective tissue, and a layer of muscle tissue. And then there's some nervous tissue that's kind of scattered between those other tissue types as well. Animal cells do not have a cell wall. So when we talked about bacteria and plants, we talked about cells that had cell walls, but animal cells do not have a cell wall. You're probably familiar with this picture here of a kind of a typical or generic animal cell. In reality, these cells can take on a lot of different specialization, so they can actually change quite a bit in what they look like and their structure and function. Now, some cells may be embedded in what is called the extracellular matrix, and this is sometimes abbreviated as the ECM. And to give you an example, so this is a connective tissue down here. Actually, both of these are connective tissue, but this one on the left is a fibrous connective tissue. And you can see these little kind of purple ovals here. These are the cells. So it says fibroblasts, but these are the cells. And then all this stuff in between it. So all of these kind of like stringy like things in between, all of this is actually extracellular matrix. So in this case, these are protein fibers. So you can see collagen fibers here. Collagen is just a type of protein. So these are protein fibers that kind of create a mesh that these cells are then kind of attached to and scattered around inside this extracellular matrix. And this extracellular matrix can take on different forms. So this fibrous connective tissue has a little bit of stretch and give to it. But if we look at this structure over here, so this is looking at the microscopic structure of bone. And in this picture, it's a little bit hard to see because it's kind of small, but you can see these little kind of dark bits right here. Those little dark bits are actually the cells. And everything else you see, so these kind of the rings around here, so all this area in between the cells, this is the extracellular matrix. And in bone tissue, this extracellular matrix is hard. It contains minerals, and that's how our bones get their strength. There are other types of extracellular matrix, and we'll talk about those more in a different lesson, but this is just kind of introducing the concept of cells and extracellular matrix. The general life cycle of animals, they do not have the alternation of generations like plants. So if you remember in plants, they had both a sporophyte generation and a gametophyte generation. And both of these were multicellular. And the main difference is that the sporophyte generation was diploid, and the gametophyte generation was haploid. Now in animals, like I said, we do not have this alternation of generations. So most animals are what we call diplontic, and diplontic means that the kind of the dominant stage is a multicellular diploid stage. So this is the dominant stage that makes up an animal's body and cells. So if you think about a human, the vast majority of our cells are diploid. They have two copies or two sets of chromosomes in them. And we, as a living organism, are multicellular. We're actually made up of trillions of cells. Now, animals do typically have a haploid stage, but it is unicellular. And it's really only to produce these reproductive cells. So the gametes, which we know as things like egg and sperm. And these are produced via meiosis. Now, these gametes are different from the gametophyte stage in plants because remember, in plants, The gametophyte is an actual kind of independent organism that is multicellular. But in animals, in this diplontic life cycle, we really only have these unicellular gametes, and the gametes can't survive on their own. They have to survive inside an organism. They might be released from the organism, but if they're not fertilized and turn into a zygote and start developing pretty quickly, then they don't survive as their own organism for very long. Now, there are some exceptions to these rules. So there are some organisms, so some examples are bees, wasps, and ants. The multicellular males are made out of haploid cells. So this is kind of like that gametophyte generation, I guess, but it's only in males. And that's only because the males of these organisms develop from unfertilized eggs. Remember, an egg is haploid. And then typically you have a sperm, which is also haploid. And when the sperm fertilizes the egg, you typically get a zygote that is diploid. Then that zygote goes through mitosis to form two cells that are both diploid. Two cells turn into four, four turn into eight, eight turn into 16, etc., etc. But with these males of the bees, wasps, and ants, what happens is that there is no sperm involved. Instead, this egg is going to go through mitosis without becoming a zygote, and it's going to form two cells that are haploid. Those two cells are going to become four cells that are haploid, which will become eight, etc., until you get this male organism that only has haploid cells. So we talked about this a little bit on the last slide, but let's go over it again. Sexual reproduction is the most common way that animals reproduce. And what happens is that there is a male gamete, that is a sperm, and this male gamete has a nucleus that is haploid. All right, and so haploid means that it has one set of chromosomes inside its nucleus. And then there is a haploid female gamete that is an egg. And it also has a nucleus that is haploid. And what happens is that if a sperm fertilizes an egg, then what happens is those two nuclei are going to fuse, and they end up creating something called a zygote. And that zygote has a nucleus that is diploid because it has the set of chromosomes from the sperm. So let's say that these are we'll say the sperm here had 4 chromosomes that were inside this nucleus. And then let's say that there were 4 in the egg, and I'm just going to draw those in yellow. And so the zygote is going to end up having the 4 chromosomes from the male gamete and the 4 chromosomes from the female gamete, and that's what makes it diploid. And so remember that these chromosomes here are known as paired chromosomes. They're also called homologous chromosomes. And you get them one from mom, one from dad. And you probably learned about these when you learned about meiosis and mitosis and basic genetics. Later on in another video, we're going to talk about what happens to the zygote after it's formed, because it is ultimately going to go through embryonic development, but we're not going to go into that here just yet. Some animals do have the ability to reproduce asexually, meaning that they do not need a partner or another set of genetic information in order to reproduce. Some forms of asexual reproduction include budding and fragmentation. This is where part of the adult body breaks off and goes through mitosis in order to form a new organism. And we'll talk about that more when we talk a little bit more about some of the animals that actually do that. Now, parthenogenesis is where offspring develops from an unfertilized female gamete, so essentially an unfertilized egg, which we kind of talked about when we talked about insects being haploid, or the male insects being haploid. And that's because the egg goes through mitosis in order to ultimately form a male form of the insect. Now, there are some vertebrates that can do this as well. So you've maybe heard stories of like a female shark in an aquarium who did not have access to a male shark. And then all of a sudden she has baby sharks. And everyone's like, how did that happen? Because there's no boy shark around in order to fertilize these eggs. And so in these kind of rare instances, these animals can basically say, well, I guess if there's no male gametes around, I'm just going to make some of my own babies using my own DNA. And so in this case, the offspring are going to be genetically identical to the mother because it's only her genes that are going into making this new organism. Animals also develop or change over time. Even if we look at something like a human, we look very different between the time that we are born and then as we grow up during childhood, we're changing, and even to adulthood, we're changing. And this includes not only our appearance, but just how our body is working. So think about these kind of the big developmental changes that occur around puberty. And so that's kind of an example of just development over time. In some animals, the younger or larval forms might be very different from the adult forms. And so here's an example with a grasshopper of something called incomplete metamorphosis. And so basically with this, what we have is a larval or baby grasshopper that looks pretty similar to the adult grasshopper, but in this case, it doesn't have wings yet. And so over time, this grasshopper is going to go through multiple molts, and molting is just where it sheds its exoskeleton so that it can then grow bigger. And so it's going to go through these kind of multiple molts in order to get bigger and bigger. And then ultimately, the adult form is going to happen after the last molt. And this adult form is going to have those functional wings, which we can kind of see here. There will also be functional sex organs that develop after that last molt as well. You may also be familiar with something called complete metamorphosis, and this is where the larval form of an organism looks very different from the adult form. So we can take a look at this caterpillar here. And, these caterpillars, they're totally different from the adults. They look different. They have a different number of legs. They have a different diet. Just very, very different. And then they go through this metamorphosis in this chrysalis or cocoon. And when the adult form comes out, it looks completely different from the juvenile form. Now, some animals just have maybe like one larval form and then one adult form. Others might have multiple different forms that the animal goes through as it develops from, an embryo basically up to an adult. But the key thing to note is that the adult body is still developing from the same tissues that were in the larvae. So, for example, this chrysalis is actually coming from the tissues of this caterpillar here. And then the adult butterfly that comes out, these tissues are still coming or differentiating from the tissues inside the chrysalis. Animal development it really had an interesting increase in our understanding of it towards the late 1900s. So, maybe just like 20, 30 years ago. And that came with the discovery of these things called Hox genes. And these Hox genes are a specific group of animal genes called homeotic genes. And they contain these specific sequences called homeobox sequences. And these homeobox sequences code for transcription factors. And so what this means, if we take kind of a review back to what you probably learned in a previous biology class, if you remember, we have DNA, and more specifically, we have genes in our DNA. And during transcription, that information gets converted into mRNA. And then that mRNA, during translation, gets used in order to make a protein. So a transcription factor is something that can essentially turn transcription on or off. So it controls whether a gene is transcribed or not. And this transcription also refers to gene expression. So essentially, this whole process here, we know it as protein synthesis. But we can also refer to it as gene expression. Because if the gene is being expressed, then the protein is being made. So these homeobox sequences in these Hox genes are also called these master control genes. And that's because they can turn the expression of other genes on or off by making these transcription factors. So these genes can determine essentially the body plan of a developing animal. So it determines how many appendages, so 4 legs or 6 or 8, whether there are wings present, where those wings are located, etc., etc. And this all happens during embryonic development. So what happens during embryonic development is you have these undifferentiated cells that start to become differentiated or specialized. And so it's these Hox genes that turn certain genes on or off in these individual cells to determine that, this one cell is going to become a wing in this location, and this other cell is going to become a leg in this location. Now, what's interesting is that these Hox genes are homologous across the animal kingdom, meaning that every single animal has these Hox genes, or at least all the ones that we have studied so far. The genetic sequences are similar and located on the same chromosomes in the same location. And so this is also evidence that all animals evolved from a single common ancestor. And so basically the Hox genes evolved first, and then all the other animals started evolving from there. So it's one of the earliest, characteristics of animals that evolved. Now, invertebrates only have one set of Hox genes, but vertebrates have four or more sets. And so basically, more Hox genes, or the more you have, the more complex the body plan can have. So invertebrates include things like worms and insects, whereas vertebrates include things like reptiles, amphibians, and mammals.